All right, so today is finally the day. I have my laptop here and we are going to go over my spreadsheet for all the parts you need if you're going to do a manual swap on a Q50, the subframe swap, the big brake swap. I don't know, everything you want to know really is going to be covered in this video. So we're going to start with the manual swap because that's what I think most people are here for. So there's all the parts that you need for the outside of the car, and then there's parts that you need for the inside of the car. We're going to start with the parts that you need for the outside of the car, all the mechanical parts. So let's start with the transmission and what options you have for the transmission. And you really have two. You can buy a JK41A or JK41B transmission. You can still buy these new from Nissan, but they're a lot cheaper if you buy them used. So these transmissions were used in 370Zs and G37s. The CD variants were used in G35s, first generation G35s, as well as 350s. And they bolt up to a VQ35. And that is not the same bell housing pattern as a VQ37. So do not buy a CD009 or any other variant. Buy a JK41A or a JK41B. Okay, so what is your other option if you're not going to use one of those? You can use a transmission from an RZ34. And this is the transmission that Nissan made to bolt up to a VR30. So if you're using a VR30, you can buy one of these. You can also just use a JK transmission, which is what I did. If you have a VQ37 Q50, just buy a JK41A or B. Now, there are several different variants of these transmissions. You can get them with or without the Synchro Rev Match. You don't want it. It's probably, I don't even know if you can really wire it in, but if you could, it would just be a pain in the butt, and it's not really that nice to have anyway, just Rev Match when you're driving the car. Now, as far as the bell housing pattern goes, if you have a VR30 car and you use a JK41A, there are two things to keep in mind here. Number one is you are going to have to notch the bell housing for your crank sensor. This is super easy to do. You can buy a template for this from Concept Z, which is what I did. It's just a 3D printed template, very cheap. I think they charged me $10 shipped. They'd probably throw it in for free if you were buying other stuff. And the other thing to keep in mind, and this really doesn't matter at all, but I'm just telling you so that you know, there are 4 small bolts on the bell housing, on the bottom side of the bell housing, and they actually bolt in from the engine side. These will not line up if you have a VR30 car. It's really not that big of a deal. They're not there for any structural purpose. They're very small bolts. All of the holding power, the clamping force for the transmission of the engine is going to come from the larger 17mm head bolts and not the smaller bolts down below. Now, if you buy a transmission for a RZ34, it just bolts right on. You don't have to do anything. It's literally the same engine in an RZ34 as a Q50, a VR30 Q50. Same exact engine. All right, one other thing to mention, if you are going to use a JK transmission, these have concentric slave cylinders, which means that the entire slave cylinder assembly is inside the transmission. It's not that big of a deal, and you can buy upgraded CSCs if you want to go that route, but I did a CSC elimination kit so that I could have an external slave cylinder. If you buy a RZ34 transmission, you don't have to worry about this because Nissan already went back to an external slave cylinder. Want to know why? Because they're way better. CSCs suck. So the CSC elimination kit that I used is the 2nd generation Z1 CSC elimination kit. Wow, that's a mouthful. And this bolted right on, and it's pretty fantastic. I actually don't have any complaints about it. Their 1st generation kit was not good at all. It had all sorts of problems. Now you can also buy a couple other kits. You can buy one from Z-Speed, and a lot of people like that. The Z-Speed kit comes with an actual dust boot, which is really nice. And Concept Z also makes a elimination kit, which I believe is actually pretty good. The reviews on it were pretty good, and I almost pulled the trigger on that one, but I bought this stuff during Black Friday, and the Z1 kit was on sale, so I just went that route. And again, I have no complaints. In fact, a lot of the parts that they use on that kit are OEM parts. The fork looks like it's custom made, and then there's a couple mounts that are custom made. But the throwout bearing is a factory throwout bearing, straight from Nissan, came in a Nissan package. And the slave cylinder is also straight from Nissan, came in a Nissan package. All right, so for the mount for the transmission, you can do a couple different things here. If you want to fabricate a custom mount, you can do that. But you can also just buy a G37 transmission mount and it will bolt right onto the car. So if you can score a used G37 transmission and it has the mount still attached, that's perfect. You don't have to do anything else. The shifter, you can use the factory shifter if you want. However, any short shifter kits that are drop-in kits for a G37 or a 370 will work great with this setup. The shifter bracket puts the shifter in the right location. You don't have to worry about relocating anything. Clutch and flywheel. There's a couple different options here. I am using a VR30 manual conversion flywheel for this, and I bought mine from Z1. I bought it when it was on sale. It was pretty cheap. I think I paid 200 bucks for it. And it's a pretty nice flywheel. You can also buy a flywheel from Concept Z, and I believe this is, I want to say it's a Jim Wolf flywheel. So when I bought my flywheel, it's like 200 bucks. The last time I checked, both of these flywheels cost about $500. Now, with Black Friday right around the corner, Z1 normally runs some pretty good Black Friday sales, and if I had to guess, they're probably going to discount this flywheel again. So if you're not in a rush, wait for Black Friday. Now, you can also just use a clutch and flywheel package for an RZ34, and these may or may not be cheaper. That's kind of up to you to decide. I can only give you recommendations here. Ultimately, you need to make the decisions on what items you're gonna buy based on how much money you have, how much do you care about, using XYZ clutch and flywheel, etc. So for the Z1 conversion flywheel, that uses a standard G37 clutch package. So I bought a clutch package from Z1 as well, which has so far been holding on fine, haven't had any problems with it. And I'll leave a link to that in the description, but if you're gonna use a RZ34 flywheel, I would recommend just getting an RZ34 clutch kit as well. All right, so for the master cylinder, I am using a master cylinder from, what am I using it from? All right, so for the master cylinder, I am using the master cylinder from a 370Z, and I'm also using the fluid reservoir. It came as a whole package. Now, one thing I'm gonna say here is you can use one from a 350Z or a G35. It's just a master cylinder. It's gonna be pretty close to the same across all these cars. I believe the bore size is the same. You're gonna be pushing the same amount of fluid regardless of which one you buy. On the G37 and 370Z master cylinders, the cutout that goes up against the firewall is not perfectly round. However, on a 350Z and a G35, it is perfectly round. So you can just hole saw it and it'll be perfect. If you're gonna use one from the 370 or the G37, you can do an oversized hole, or you can drill the hole and then file it out using a template. But just know that either option will work totally fine. Now you can kind of mix and match where you're buying these parts. I bought a lot of these used on eBay. Probably not the cheapest way to do it, but I am lazy. But if you go to a junkyard, you can also get a ton of these parts for really cheap, or you can buy them new, either OEM or aftermarket. Somewhere like Rock Auto is pretty good for that. All right, so we have almost everything we need for the outside of the car. What else do we need? The clutch line. For this, it's very simple. Just buy a one-piece clutch line. It makes it very simple. And I believe, curious, where's my clutch line? Oh, here we go. I will have a link for the one that I bought in the spreadsheet that I'm gonna post in the description. That being said, mine was a little too long. I think I bought a 47-inch. You could go with the next smaller size and it would probably fit a lot better. All right, so the next part that you need to consider is gonna be the drive shaft. Now, the drive shaft in my car is the reason that my uploads have been so slow recently. Quite frankly, I've been fighting my drive shaft for the last 3 months or so. So I'm gonna make this super, super simple. If you are going to do a manual swap and you're going to swap your subframe to a G35 subframe and you're going to use a G35 or G37 differential, this is what you do. Buy a single piece drive shaft for a G35 or G37. It's going to be the same drive shaft. Doesn't matter if it's a coupe or a sedan, the wheelbase is the same length, it's going to fit. I think Inland Empire makes them, or Driveshaft Shop makes them. You can buy them from Z1, you can buy them from Concept Z. Just buy that drive shaft. It will come pre-balanced, it'll come with the slip yoke, it'll come with the flange, the U-joints, everything you need, and it'll bolt right into the car and fit perfectly. Okay, so that only pertains to those of you that are going to swap your rear subframe. If you're going to keep the factory Q50 subframe, then this is what you do. You take your factory drive shaft, you call a drive shaft shop, or driveline shop, that's often what they're called too. So you take your drive shaft there, and you need the front shaft lengthened. How much do you need it lengthened? Actually, that's a good question. How much do you need it lengthened? Let's see. 3 3/8 inches. And that will give you the extension that you need. Now, why are you doing this? Because the factory automatic transmission is longer than the manual transmission that you're putting in there. So your drive shaft is going to end up being too short. Now, in addition to doing that, you are also going to need a slip yoke for a CD009 or JK41A or the RZ34 transmission. It's the same slip yoke for all of them, and I will have a link for the slip yoke in the spreadsheet that I'm going to post. Those are pretty much the only two recommendations that I would make as far as the drive shaft goes. Also, a G35 or G37 factory drive shaft, a factory two-piece drive shaft, it's not going to fit. The center carrier bearing location is different on a G35 and G37 chassis versus a Q50 or Q60 chassis. It's not going to fit. Don't do it. Don't buy it. All right, now let's move on to the interior of the car. And I'm not going to list out all the part numbers on camera that you need for this because there's a lot of them. And you really don't even have to replace the center console if it's something, you know, like a drift car, or you don't really care about what the interior looks like. But if you want it to look nice, just buy the OEM components because they're readily available. They fit right in the car and they look fantastic. So for the center console area, you're gonna need the center console, the side panels, you're gonna need the shifter bezel, the armrest, the back panel finisher. There's a bunch of different stuff. Again, I will link all of this stuff in the spreadsheet. And last I checked, Z1 sells pretty much all of it. So when you're doing the center console swap, if you have a, I wanna say it's 2020 and up, if you have a 2020 and up Q50 or Q60, you have a USB-C port in your center console, and the wiring is not compatible. The connectors that Nissan used are different. Now you could probably just hack up the wiring harness and you could get it to work. I didn't do that. I retained the wiring from the Q50, and I just kind of have it all shoved into the armrest. It doesn't look great if you open the armrest, but I don't really care. So other stuff that you need for the interior of the car. You're gonna need the clutch pedal and you're gonna need the handbrake. So the clutch pedal that I'm using came from a 370Z and it looks pretty good in the car. I actually got it leveled out pretty well. I think you could probably just use a G37 clutch pedal as well. I don't really think there's gonna be much difference between the two. Now, for those of you who have already done some research, you will probably know that the Q50 came manual in Europe. Obviously, that's where the center console pieces come from. And that means that there's also a clutch pedal available from those cars too. Well, it's kind of hard to get the clutch pedal, and then getting the master cylinder is even harder. And if you think that I was just being lazy and I didn't want to deal with it, Concept Z tried this first and they could not get the Euro clutch pedal to work. And last I checked, they have it for sale on eBay. So if you want to go that route, just go buy that one off eBay. And remember, this is just a parts video. If you want to see the installation for all of these components, I have videos outlining all of that. I do want to make one quick note here pertaining to the center console. If you're doing the center console swap so that you can have a handbrake and whatnot, the trim surround piece, whatever you want to call it, that goes around the handbrake, it's a piece of rubber. Nissan no longer makes them, and they're pretty hard to find. But if you're going to look for one, you need one from a G37 or a second generation G35. But a first generation G35 is different. A 350Z is different, and I believe a 370Z is also different. All right, now, as far as the handbrake goes, I am using one out of a 370Z G37. I think they're exactly the same, quite frankly. And I drilled some holes in the chassis, and then I used riv nuts to install it. I just lined it all up. Again, you can go watch the interior video where I go over that a little more in detail. Now, you need a emergency brake cable pass-through that goes through the transmission tunnel down into the transmission tunnel underneath the car. And Concept Z does make this, and that's who I bought it from. And it fits perfectly. It sealed it off really nicely. I did use a little bit of RTV, and yeah, it fits great. So when you're buying your handbrake, try to find one that has the handbrake cable still attached. You don't want to have to source all of these things separately. It gets really annoying. And that handbrake cable will just bolt right up to your parking brake cables for the rear. Now, you might have to mess with the lengths a little bit and do some adjustment with the parking brake, but it's not the end of the world. It'll work. It works fine on my car, so it should work fine on yours. All right, so let's get into the rear subframe. Now, if you're wondering, what's the purpose of swapping out the rear subframe to a G35 subframe? The biggest reason that I did it is because you can now pick between a plethora of different gearing options. Now, if you don't know anything about gearing, go watch some videos about it because I'm not going to talk about it right now. But basically, the factory Q50 final drive gearing is 313 if it's a red sport, and I believe 296 if it's a non-red sport. Just in case you were curious, that's a really, really long final gear. So you can run that gearing with a manual transmission and the car will work fine. It's just gonna feel kind of sluggish. The automatic transmissions that were in the car are 7-speed transmissions. Seven, yeah. They're 7-speed transmissions, and the gearing on the transmission is very short, so it pairs well with a longer final drive, and you get better gas mileage that way, etc., etc. So I am using a 3.69, somewhere in that range. I don't remember what they are. There's so many different ratios. That's what I'm using in my car, and that is the factory gearing ratio from a G37 or a 370Z that Nissan chose to pair with their manual transmissions. Now you also have other options. The automatics for the G37s and the 370s, they had different gearing ratios. 350Zs and G35s had different gearing ratios for their manual transmissions. I believe they were 353. I don't know. I'll list the specs on the screen somewhere, like right here, and you guys can just pick what you want. Now there's two things to remember here when it comes to your gearing ratios. It affects your acceleration and it affects your gas mileage. I chose to just go with a factory gearing ratio and I really like it. I believe with my car, I'm around 3,000 RPM when I'm doing 80 miles an hour on the highway. So as far as the actual subframe goes, getting back on topic for a minute. So as far as the actual subframe goes, you can use one from a G35 or you can use one from a G37 or a 350Z or a 370Z. They're kind of all the same with some minor differences. So for starters, the G35 and the 350Z, they use aluminum subframes. Now, if you go with a 370Z or a G37 subframe, they are stamped steel subframes, which is perfectly fine. And you'll get the benefits of the differential even if you go with one of those. But if you can find an aluminum subframe, I would say buy that. Now you can run all factory control arms on this. However, you need to remember that the track width, the rear track width on a G35, 350, blah, 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 all the cars that are not Q50s, you need to remember that the track width on those cars is actually more narrow than it is on a Q50. So you either need to run wheel spacers, you need to run some fat wheels, or your wheels are just going to be very sunken in your wheel wells in the rear. So my subframe that I got was totally destroyed, and because of that I chose to replace all of my control arms. I even replaced the knuckles. I replaced pretty much everything on there. The only thing I reused was the subframe itself. So I used Kinetics control arms and I used some ISR control arms. Yeah, I used Kinetics and then I used ISR control arms. And again, they just bolted right on, and now I have a fully adjustable rear subframe in the car. All the control arms are adjustable, except for my upper control arms. I did just buy some factory spec Mevotech upper control arms. Now, when it comes to coilovers, because a lot of us are going to be running coilovers if we're doing this, you can run Q50 coilovers on your car. That's exactly what I'm doing. The only thing you need to do is you need to add some spacers, some washers on the bottom mount, because the G35 knuckles are, the bushing on them is a little more narrow than it is on a Q50. Now you might be able to just press the bushing out of your Q50 knuckles and put them in your G35 or G37 knuckles. I did not try that. I didn't really care. I just made some spacers on my lathe, but you can get away with just using some washers. Now your other option would be to get some mildly custom coilovers made. If you haven't bought coilovers yet and you want to do this, you can call up Feel Suspension and they will make you a set of Q50 coilovers, and they will put G35 or G37 bottom mounts on the rear coilovers. So if you want no spacers, you want it as close to factory as possible, I guess, you can go that route. Just in case you were wondering, yes, these are true coilovers in the rear of this car, even though G35s and 350s and 370s and maybe G37s, but I don't think G37s, they all had a divorced rear coil setup. So you had the shock and then you had the coil separately from that. Now, if you do this, obviously you don't need the bucket arms anymore and you can get them swapped out, but you can also just leave the bucket arms in there even without a coil spring in there. It's not gonna matter. All right, let's talk about your brakes for a minute, because if you're gonna swap out the rear subframe, you're probably gonna have questions about what brakes fit and what brakes don't fit. So, the big brake kit that Nissan offered from the factory, the Akebono, however you want to say it, the calipers are the same for G37s, Q50s, Q60s, 370Zs, even the new RZ34 uses the same exact calipers. But if you know anything about G35s and 350s, you'll know that they used Brembo calipers, and they are not the same setup. That being said, the Akebono calipers will bolt right onto G35 and 350Z knuckles. It doesn't matter, they bolt right on. All right, so for the front of the car, obviously you can just run whatever the factory brakes are for a Q50 or a Q60. You don't have to do any modifications there. On a G35 subframe, I'm using G35 knuckles, and I am using rotors from a G37 and calipers from a G37. And I will leave a link to the exact rotors and pads that I used. Now, as far as the calipers go, you can buy the calipers from Z1, Concept Z, Rock Auto, eBay, Facebook Marketplace. It just depends on if you want a fully freshened up, powder coated, rebuilt set of calipers, or if you can find a set of calipers that are not refinished but don't need rebuilding, etc., etc. I bought mine on eBay. I think I paid around $350 for my set. I just cleaned them up and then they looked, okay, they don't look brand new, but they look fine. They look okay. So they're on the car, they don't leak. I'm not gonna powder coat them. I don't care. The factory finish looks decent enough. Now, when you're doing this, all of your factory parking brake hardware on G35 knuckles will function with G37 rotors. And I chose to just rebuild the parking brake hardware because it was pretty rusted on the knuckles that I got. And I also replaced both of the rear wheel bearings on this car as well. If you're gonna replace the rear wheel bearings, I would highly recommend that you either buy OEM Nissan wheel bearings, or possibly the better option is to buy Timken wheel bearings. I don't know why, but I always seem to have the worst luck with Nissans and wheel bearings, specifically in the rear of the car. So from here on out, I'm only buying Timken wheel bearings because they seem to hold up a lot better than stuff like a Mevotech or a Moog or the really bad brands like FVP or whatever it is. I don't even know. All right, thanks for watching, guys. I know that was kind of a long one, and I hope that it's gonna help you guys out. And like I said, if you're gonna do this swap and you're not in a rush, wait until Black Friday. You're probably gonna catch some decent deals on some parts. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to leave a comment. I do read all the comments, which I know I only get like 10 comments on most of my videos, if that, but I do read them and I try to offer whatever help I can. Please like, comment, subscribe, do all that stuff. It really does help the channel. We have over 300 subscribers now. Pretty cool. Didn't think that was gonna happen, but I'm glad that you guys are enjoying the content. In terms of how the car feels, it feels so much better driving a manual swapped Q50 over the factory auto Q50. I know that the tune came out for the autos now, and I'm sure that makes them a lot better, but I just don't like automatic cars. I don't like driving them. So this is really not a hard swap to do. I've said this before. It's just like manual swapping any other car, and everything bolts right on. The next video I post will be me driving this car.